Hello, and welcome to the Super 70 Podcast, Episode 23, The 49th Parallel. I will be using the Criterion Collection DVD issued in 2010, but you can also find the 49th Parallel on Vudu and Amazon Prime. If you hit play on the DVD now, this podcast should sync with the rest of the film. If you are playing a streaming version, you will be ahead for 2 or 3 seconds. It's our second Criterion in a row.
Well, aren't we hoity-toity?
Especially with Janus Films. Michael Powell was a Brit who started as a gopher in European cinema in 1925. In the late 30s, famous European expat director Alexander Korda, who had fled Hungary for Britain's open-ended cinema, hired Michael Powell to direct The Spy in Black in 1939. Korda also hired Emeric Pressburger, another Hungarian Jew, who also left Hungary only for UFA in Berlin, where he was a script doctor. From there, he fled to Paris in 1935 when the Nuremberg Laws took effect, and Korda brought him to London to work on The Spy in Black. Pressburger and Powell started a collaboration that lasted until 1970 and counted 24 films under their production company, which they called The Archers. Although The 49th Parallel is a Powell and Pressburger film, it predates the Archer period. We open with a passing airplane shot of a glacier in Alberta's Rocky Mountains, most likely in Banff National Park, where the climax of The 49th Parallel takes place. The opening declarative script immediately identifies the film as UK propaganda, and it would not have been a surprise for film audiences in Canada or the United States to learn that this film was financed by the British government for the sole purpose of eliciting sympathy in the voting electorate in North America.
Especially in the United States.
Especially in the United States. And although the 49th Parallel was shot in Canada with a mixed Canadian crew in front of behind the cameras, and the Canadian viewpoint is very important, the true purpose of the 49th Parallel was to sway American public opinion into joining the British war effort.
Yeah, because they had that strange thought that Nazis were bad.
They were bad people.
It's unusual.
The film is a direct result of the Second World War. The outbreak of the war in September 1939 led to a reorganization in the British government to fight the war, including an organized effort to define the war in a reinstatement of the Ministry of Information, or MOI, created the day after Britain declared war on Germany. The first leader of the MOI, as it was called, was Lord Macmillan, a member of the House of Lords who did such a horrible job that the general public gave the MOI a new moniker, that of the Ministry of Disinformation. Macmillan was replaced in January of 1940 by Sir John Reith, who we can assume did not that much better of a job, as Winston Churchill replaced him with a guy named, get this, Duff Cooper, in May of 1940.
Big fan of the beer.
Sounds like a British spy. Shortly after, Churchill was appointed Prime Minister by the King of England, George VI. Now, notice that we focus on all of North America before we center on the 49th Parallel. We get the gist that the film is not just pointed to Canada, but about Canada's only neighbor, the United States. The narrative's assertion that this is the world's longest unguarded and peaceful border is true, but it is not without intrigue. Famous Canadian historian Pierre Burton wrote about the Canadian spies mapping invasion routes south of the 49th Parallel as late as 1935. This is the front range behind Kananaskis National Park, just past Canmore, Alberta, on your way into Banff National Park. This is along Route 1, the Trans-Canada Highway, which theoretically runs from St. John's Harbor in Newfoundland to Stanley Park in Vancouver, the longest highway in the world. It runs to the south of the Bow River, which flows out of Banff National Park to Calgary, Alberta. On the north side of the Bow River is the Bow Valley Trail, which parallels the river. In fact, you'll pick up on a lot of parallels in the film, as Powell and Pressburger seem to have selected the word not just as a title, but as a theme. The city of Calgary and the aerial view of its aerial stockyards, making it the Fort Worth of the North, is briefly replaced by the lakes of Manitoba before we focus on the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Powell and Pressburger have keenly shown us where we are going by backtracking to where we start our history. The real U-37 was commissioned in 1938 and sunk 53 ships, including 2 British warships. It fled to Flensburg shortly before capitulation was scuttled under the surrender of May 8, 1945. The filmmakers had no way to verify the names of submarines, so they just used a random one. There was a second U-37, which served during the First World War, I guess you would call it the first U-37, which was also scuttled under the armistice in 1918. This is not a real German Unterseeboot, but rather a mock set built by the Canadian design crew in Halifax, Nova Scotia for the film. At the opening of the war, the MOI established the film's division to promote Allied propaganda through documentary and feature films. The department head of the film's division of the MOI also experienced high turnover. But by January of 1940, the film's division established an ideas committee to pitch documentary projects and feature films and shortlisted plans to proceed a film aimed at the morale of the Canadian electorate. The 49th Parallel, for instance. It took about 21 months from the Ideas Committee to pitch the film's premiere on October 8, 1941, and it premiered in the United States on 15th of April, 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. It was the highest-earning film in Britain in 1942, and it not only paid back what it spent out of the UK government, but it gave the government huge profits as well. And now, without delaying for another second, let's welcome Dave Anderson back into the Hacienda. Dave, when was the first time you saw the 49th Parallel, and what did you think?
I think actually the first time I saw the 49th Parallel was earlier this week when I watched a copy of this provided by my good friend Dileneated. Obviously had known about the film, like almost all of the Powell Pressburger films that I have seen, but it was the first time I had an opportunity to see this. It was on my to-get list for quite a while. I just never did. You know, Barnes & Noble 50% sales are usually where I stock up, and I never had an opportunity on this one. And I enjoyed it quite a bit. I thought it was a tremendous thriller. It's an obvious propaganda piece, but it doesn't feel... I mean, obviously I'm going to be biased, but it didn't feel as bang-you-over-the-head propaganda, although I may be kidding myself on that.
Like a lot of German propaganda that we see.
Right, which, I mean, obviously we're going to have a different perspective because, you know, we're the good guys.
Right.
But
we won.
We won. Which doesn't dismiss the fact that we're still the good guys, relatively speaking. But, yeah, I enjoyed it immensely and thought the performances were tremendous, and we will get to those. And obviously that's my word of the podcast.
Right. I saw this a couple of years ago. Actually, I bought this when I still lived in the States, and when I moved to Alberta, I watched it when I was up there, and I was shocked to actually see Banff National Park and places that I drove past in order to get to Banff. And there are other shots that are in Banff later in the film, like, oh my God, that's Banff Springs Bridge, that's the Banff Town Square, and I had no clue. And one of the really surprising things is when you went to Banff and you went into the stores as a tourist, you didn't see the 49th Parallel anywhere. It's like nobody knew anything about the film. You would ask locals who live there, and people who live in Banff, they're sort of grandfathered in because it's a national park. So the only way you can live there is if you were born there, basically. Or the only way you can sell a house there is to another person who's from Banff. And no one knew about the film. None of the waiters or none of the owners or anything. I found that astounding. And I thought the film was really good, but again, like, we're biased, right?
Well, we are biased, but it's also one of those where this is definitely a piece designed for the specific time that it came out, right? And it doesn't have that place in the public consciousness like some of the other films of the similar era, where it maintained its universally, accepted classic.
Sure.
But I do think it's actually, I enjoyed it quite a bit.
I think it's tremendous propaganda, and Michael Powell is probably the beginning, middle, and end of why. And so we're cued with several things of, sinking the ship, of pushing the British sailor out in the water, and then the sinister picture of Hitler touching a child.
Yes.
Which probably made everybody in Britain in 1940 just go...
Yes, but was... probably, I don't know how much it would have affected, say, American audiences at the time. The Canadians were involved in the war when this was made, correct?
Right.
At least by the setting of the movie. But even then, I don't know how personally attached they would have been to the image of Hitler. Certainly not as, dynamic as the Brits.
Right, and you raise an interesting point while we look at Eric Portman here. This is a great propaganda film, but as they go, it's a strange one, and it's strange because of the timing, like you were saying. And unfortunately... it helps if I explain the timing of this film to understand why it stands out among other propaganda films. The war breaks out in September of 1939. As of that date, there's really no reason by many on all sides to think that this war will be any different than the last one. In fact, most people on the planet, not just in Britain, think that this will play out in the same manner as the First World War. The shock comes when the war starts and Germany invades Poland. By the end of August 1939, the Polish campaign is over. So half of Poland belongs to the Soviet Union because they made a deal with the Nazis a month before the war. And the two dictatorships split that country between them. So Germany isn't taking all of Poland, just lands that mostly previously belonged to Germany before the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. And when that war is over, and it happened really fast, the campaign between the Air Force, what the Germans called the Luftwaffe, and the Army, called the Heer, and the tanks, called the Panzers, it happened so fast that France and Britain, which declared war on Germany, they were really flabbergasted at the speed. I mean, they were shocked at how fast the Germany conquered Poland. They thought it was going to be a repeat of 1914, trenches and everything, essentially a stalemate. Mm-hmm. So that infected their thinking. And Britain is going to spend most of the next 3 months ferrying the army to France. So now you're talking December 1939, now January of 1940, still no fighting war between Britons and Germans. In fact, the British and Germans. The Battle of France, which is the German invasion of France, does not take place until June of 1940. So you have this 10-month period in the beginning of the war where nothing happens. There's no armies going anywhere except the Italians driving around the desert in Africa. And there's no doubt in Britain that the Nazis are this nefarious gangster dictatorship. They know that for sure. But the Holocaust is still 2 years away, and the ethnic cleansing of Poland is not front-page news and wouldn't be for a long time. So there's this 10-month period where the Germans are definitely our enemy, and we need America and Canada's help to fight them. But we're not in that evil stage just yet. And that's the period where this film was conceived and filmed.
Gotcha.
And again, like it came out in October of 1940 in Britain, but it wasn't, I remember Pearl Harbor's like 2 months away. Mm-hmm. And then it wasn't released in the States until April of 1941. 42. So the timing of it it hit at just the right time in Britain and just the right time in America. By the time this came out in America, Americans were primed for watching something like this. And this reminds me a lot of other films. I mean, Run Silent, Run Deep, of course. But I'm really thinking like The Hunt for Red October.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
Really, and it makes me think that McTiernan at least saw this.
Oh, I would imagine so. It's just one of those sequences that is very consistent with all other portrayals of later. So if not this movie specifically, then one of its.
Yeah, or Raiders of the Lost Ark. Like thinking that Steven Spielberg didn't see a Michael Powell film with a submarine before he did the ending of Raiders. That's kind of absurd.
It seems impossible.
Yeah. And Pressburger went to Canada with a scouting crew that took 3 weeks. He went to Canada during the blockade. So he went on a ship. He ran through the blockade with a Canadian crew, shot all this, and then ran through the blockade back to Britain.
Certainly a level of elevated risk level.
Yeah. And when he came back, London was in the Blitz. So imagine that. I mean, that's crazy. So he returned to Canada with a few more Brits, the technical crew, and they shot for 9 weeks mainly in Nova Scotia and Alberta. The entire movie was pitched, written, and shot around two ruling concepts that the Ministry of Information wanted every propaganda piece to focus on, which is why we fight and what are we fighting for.
Mm-hmm. Which is pretty... I mean, it beats you over the head on both topics for this particular movie. But... it doesn't bother me, but it's definitely clearly spelled out.
Yeah, they're constantly espousing ideology, which, I mean, to know someone who is a National Socialist, how can you not? Now, the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, is kind of an oddball when it comes to the ideological fight. They weren't exceptionally ideological. A lot of them were. All of them were volunteers. You had to volunteer to get into a U-boat, and so you do have that kind of ideology in the crew. But among the officer corps, you really didn't. The Kriegsmarine was not ideological like, say, the Luftwaffe.
Right.
Like the Luftwaffe was born by Hermann Goering, and it was created ideologically. It was almost a part of the Nazi party machine, right? And Hitler was completely sold on that fact. So. In reality, the sailors would probably be more ideological than the officers, so that part would be true. But as far as having this guy who is an over-the-top officer, that wouldn't necessarily be the case.
No, but you have to put it in there because he's the one in charge of the crew, and right. I think that the crew is portrayed. It's pretty interesting, frankly, for a propaganda film. Oh, the explosion here was tremendous.
Oh yeah, because I love it.
And they rigged up the actual model with real
to actually blow up. Yeah.
So one of those that probably wouldn't happen today, even just because, not necessarily because of CGI. But
right. Well, I was thinking U-571, 1999, with Matthew McConaughey. And
I haven't seen it.
You haven't seen? Oh man, that shot of the U-boat blowing up was just right out of it. You got to see that, man. It's got John Bon Jovi in it.
I know that, and that's one of the after,
look at that.
He did Young Guns 2, and that was enough.
John Bon Jovi was in Young Guns 2?
Mm-hmm. 2 or 1 of the 2. I believe it's 2.
He did the soundtrack for 2.
He did, but I believe he gets shot in 2 in a split-second cameo. Okay. See, I watch the important things.
Right.
But even here, where they're having to maintain discipline, they're not portrayed as a bunch of buffoons.
Right.
They're presented as professional and intelligent and, certainly dangerous. But it is one of those where, for a propaganda piece, they're given a certain degree of respect, which is, partially unanticipated. I
would say so. Now, when you see the Inuits, First Nations, as we say in Canada, we don't use the I word in Canada. It's insulting. What came to mind seeing the indigenous people, like as far as film's concerned? Anything pop up?
Well, you have Nanook of the North.
That's exactly what I was.
Right, which is kind of the touchstone of that type of portrayal in this area. Not area, but north.
Yeah.
North of the 49th parallel.
Yeah, now I don't remember where Nanook of the North was shot, but it's an exceptional quote-unquote documentary that we found out decades later that a lot of it was staged.
Yeah, it's a Michael Moore film.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. There might be some truth to it. Even
there is certainly always some degree, but it doesn't matter, right? It's in and of itself an entertaining picture, which is the primary objective of pretty much any film, in my opinion. It has to be at least some degree entertaining.
Right. The thing that I forgot to mention earlier. Did you ever see Sink the Bismarck? Another British propaganda piece that
I saw that when I was really, really, really young, younger than 10, because as a kid, one of my favorite models was the Bismarck.
Yeah.
I had received a model of it, built it. I didn't associate it with much of anything beyond being a really awesome model.
Yeah.
But the name is very attractive, and a huge fan of North Dakota, of course. But I think I'd seen it like on television. It was color. I'm not that old, but it was, or at least the television was color.
Yeah, it was black and white.
Yeah,
so you must have seen a Ted Turner version.
No. What I'm getting at, the television
was color, but you were watching a black and white.
Projection.
Yeah, okay.
So I was really quite young when I'd seen it.
Yeah, that briefly, and that was again another propaganda film that was made during the war. Olivier, yeah.
I was amazed to find out that beard was not real. That was exceptionally well done. That was a prosthetic that they put on him.
He, at the time, was probably, next to Leslie Howard and Nigel Hawthorne, I think. One of the most popular living British actors ever.
Yes, and
Charles Laughton.
Yeah, and he turns it up to 11 in this.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
And I can see where I've read some criticism where he portrays it as so over the top, it's absurd. But I think it actually kind of works here in the beginning because the way, spoiler, he perishes. It's kind of a nice transition from establishing the seriousness of the stakes of the film.
Yeah.
And I think that works really well by countering it with his admittedly over the top and somewhat goofy and frankly naive the character.
Oh, yeah, and completely stereotyped. Mm-hmm. Like if you were to put any Canadian in a room and say what's your stereotype of a Quebecois, they would probably describe
something like this.
Yeah, Laurence Olivier's performance in this film. But he's an over the top actor, and he always has been. Like I saw his Othello that he did, I think, in 1966, which today I don't think you could ever show because it's just like this completely over-the-top racist performance. But his performances are all over the top, except for, I'd say, the one performance where I think it's just absolutely pulled back. It's probably his best performance is in Marathon.
I was about to say Marathon Man be my presumption.
Completely restrained, and it's just so sinister. Of course, he's such older, but he was known for, he was the Kenneth Branagh of his era.
Right.
You know?
He's big.
Yeah, and he was drafted.
I didn't know that.
And he was in the Army. So if you wanted Olivier in your film, you had to convince the Ministry of Information that you needed him. So that's how important the 49th parallel was to the British government, was they let Olivier out to do it. And they wanted him, Powell and Pressburger wanted him in the Archers to play Colonel Blimp.
Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah, I remember reading that, but Churchill was not a fan of that script.
Right.
Which we can table that till later.
Well, yeah, he saw. Yeah, well, that might be, if we don't get to it later in this film, we'll probably get to it in the special report, because I think Churchill saw some of himself in that.
I mean, I think to a large degree, and I could be mistaken, that Olivier's character here and the way he's reacting to the news and the way he's not taking any of the situation all that seriously was designed, at least when it was made, to speak directly to the United States citizens. Because I mean, he has certainly an isolationist by his geography and being out of touch literally for the year that he was gone. Whereas, obviously at the time, the United States was very torn between isolationist ideology and getting involved.
Yeah. So, there's an element of Jeremiah Johnson going on. He comes in and what do I care? I'm French. I'm French Canadian. I'm Catholic. I'm in the Hudson Bay. Like, these things don't matter to me, like what's going on in Poland.
Right.
And I think you're right. This is engineered to be on the face of it about the Canadian situation, but underneath that, in every scene is we're trying to convince the Americans
that there's a legitimate threat and we need their help, and look how justifiable your action would be.
I'm willing to bet, by the way, that this shirt that he's wearing was red and white.
I'm not willing to take that. Yeah,
it's with dark brown pants,
Yes, it would be very on brand.
And this is, I always found this when I remember I watched this for the first time. I actually thought, man, this is really too on the nose. Like, you've got the French Canadian, the Anglo Canadian, and the Inuit Canadian in the same
scene,
house,
the same group,
same scene, same group. And there's that scene when Portman comes in with the crew. And he says, I'm Canadian, he Canadian, he Canadian. And it's like, oh, okay. Like, you didn't have to have that line.
Oh.
But at the same time, like, how could you do without that line?
Right. And I think it was a well-placed line, right? It's showing solidarity. And again, it's one of those that when I watched this, I was viewing it through what I would imagine, its political purpose to be, right? And solidarity is a big component of the whole thing. So I thought it made sense. And it's rather, not shocking, but surprising how definitive it is, especially including the Inuit servant. Inuit?
Sure.
Sorry.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's one of those that, we like to look back on times like this with a certain degree of cynicism. And I don't know if that, his statement was really outside the norm of the popular entertainment of the time, or if you just kind of view it as like, well, I wouldn't expect it to be that.
Well, I mean, obviously all I'm basing it on is the 7 years that I lived in Canada. I mean, obviously there's like a subtext of racism going on in Canadian society where that at the time they would see that completely as normal. I'm sure that Inuits and First Nations probably don't like this film because of what that role is.
Oh, I don't know. Well, I don't know if they wouldn't like. Okay, independent of that.
Right. But there would be probably some jokes in modern day, or even at the time of, well, obviously it's the French guy going out and earning the living, and it's the English guy smoking his pipe in his cabin for the year.
Right.
Right. Like crossing his legs and talking about, that war and so forth. Like, so, the people who lounge, the people who work, and then the people who really work as servants. And
this is a great introduction.
Oh,
It's straight out of a Halloween movie, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like almost like a horror. Just how they're passing by the window, or proto Hitchcock. Or I guess you could say very much like Hitchcock.
Very much like Hitchcock. Well, I said it was right out of Halloween, and that's obviously incorrect.
Well, no, I mean, it's Halloween. I mean, that's sort of Michael Myers.
Halloween is exactly... You could see where Carpenter would take that type of imagery from past films and implement it.
No, absolutely.
Even though I don't think there's a shot like that in that particular movie.
No, but it's very much in that mode.
It's very much in that mode.
Yeah, this being October, we should bring that up. Even though this isn't going to air for another month. So, I was initially, when the first time I watched, I was like, why the fuck are they calling Winnipeg? Like, if they're in the Hudson Bay.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, I actually had to get a map out and look at it. The Hudson Bay, everybody knows this. Well, you should hope, but it's huge. It's like a third of Canada. It's giant. So I was thinking they're on the northwest end or east end of the Hudson Bay, but no. I mean, if you're in the northeast or the southeast end of the Hudson Bay, you're going to be in Manitoba. Right. So of course you'd be closer to Winnipeg than you would be to Toronto or Quebec City or anything else. So that it made complete sense. This block here. And of course, the native is going to be the first to die.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but that's one of those that I was rather shocked by the violence. At this particular point. It's pretty rough. It's pretty brutal. And it's...
For a movie at the time, yeah. I mean, you have a cutaway, but it's no doubt what they're doing.
Correct. And then the aftermath that they show with the blood is, it's really more graphic than you would anticipate.
Absolutely. And you notice Olivier says he's got 8 brothers and 6 sisters. Like, what do you expect out of a French Catholic family at the time?
But, I mean, this is some really good shooting right here where they show Vogel, the character, who is about the only one of the crew that seems to have a real sense of, conscience where he's still awake.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of impressive foreshadowing if you watch it the second time.
And this guy, the engineer,
and that's whose name I was trying to look up. I mean, I think this is tremendous what he does. I think the way he's portrayed as a super genius know-it-all, at least in his own perception, and everything he does just backfires and is pretty stupid.
It does, and I was wondering, particularly with the slick back hair and a leather jacket, I was wondering if this was like just a direct rip-off of Hermann Goering.
Maybe.
He was known for being portly and in power, and I know everything.
Then the answer is probably yes. The archers are pretty clever in observation,
and it wouldn't be a big stretch at the time. I mean, Goering was the deputy Führer. Mm-hmm. He was the second in line. If anything happened to Hitler, he was next in line. And in fact, at the end of the war, he tried to exercise that, and that backfired on him badly. Right? He was later arrested. So people in Britain would definitely know who Goering was and who Himmler was as the leader of the SS. So that's not outside the realm of possibility. And I love Olivier's...
His little wink?
His wink and his righteous... I don't want to say it's on the nose righteousness. I think it's much more smoother than that. But it reminded me of, but occasionally at the end of it, and as things heat up, he gets like indignant, and that reminds me a lot of a documentary in the 1970s that he narrated called the Second World War. I think The World at War. It was originally financed by the BBC. I think it was like 16 parts. It was brilliant. I've watched it all several times. He narrates the whole thing. And there are moments, particularly in the beginning, in the first episode when they talk about the rise of Hitler, and then the last episode where they talk about the aftermath and devastation, where you can just tell, like, Olivier's, like, pissed off. Like, he's delivering these lines, and he's, like, upset.
He's got an emotional attachment.
Right.
I found this interesting. If I'm not mistaken, going on memory, this is one of the sequences that was deleted from the original American release.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because, they were talking about the priest, who is in actuality, the map maker for the Germans here. So I believe, if I'm recalling correctly, I watched the commentary track by Bruce Eder, where he mentions that this is one of the segments that was deleted, assuming my memory isn't totally addled.
Why do you think they deleted it?
Because you wanted to keep... I don't think it was definitively stated as to the why, beyond the fact that, it was, as a man of the church who was acting...
as an agent
of evil.
Yeah.
But I think it's also one of those where, we didn't... I don't want to call censors at the time, although I'm sure that... I don't think of the MPAA, right, and the board is all that is, officially censors. But it is one of those where they wanted to maximize the popularity. If it didn't pass muster, it wouldn't be released.
That's interesting. I would think that Canadians would be, or particularly French Canadians, would be more upset at that than, say, Americans. I could understand deleting it because you just didn't want to mention too much Catholicism to the American audience, because the American audience at the time was still just very much anti-Catholic until the late 1960s, I'd say. I mean, it takes Alfred E. Smith ran for president, I think, against Roosevelt in 1940. But it really takes John Kennedy in 1960 to really just make Catholicism normal among public officials and the public consciousness.
Right. And like I said, I may be mistaken, it was Canadian, but I was pretty sure that was my recollection.
Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of, it's kind of shitty compared to how not to just dive off the deep end of this particular subject, but the church was in a really tight period during the war. Mm-hmm. And it's really, I think it's kind of a black stain to put that in the film of, oh, this guy's like a Nazi agent. And the church, for the most part, particularly in Europe, they didn't have a choice. They had a gun to their head.
Well, I don't think that for the purpose of the movie, it was presented as a criticism of the Catholic Church. I think it's a very logical, we have missionaries, they're going around.
Right.
That's a perfect agent.
Right.
And it's also called back to when Olivier is passing away, where they'll send the missionaries to Germany.
Right.
Which is a good callback.
Right. That's good. Well, and in reality, the people that you had to look out for were the Bund. Mm-hmm. The Bund was particularly in America, was a really strong pro-German group of dues-paying German immigrants and their children, and particularly in the New York area, in the Washington area, in the Pittsburgh area, they were very, very strong, and they existed in Canada too. There have been just very few films made about the Bund in Canada. Just the one that pops into mind, and please forgive me for bringing this up during this podcast, but Yoga Hosers kind of touches on
some of that
Nazi sympathy in Canada during and after the war.
Okay.
Right.
I'm not going to forgive you.
Thanks.
No, I've actually not seen it, so I don't have an opinion.
Well, that would be better than most people's opinions of that movie.
That is my understanding.
Yeah. So,
and this is a pretty good battle of wits where, again, they portray Portman's character as, a pretty formidable opponent.
I think so. Yeah.
I mean, he's definitely intelligent. He is no fool and very serious. So like I said, that was one of the things that impressed me about this, because it's very easy to imagine when you say propaganda, mm-hmm. that, your enemy is portrayed as evil, mm-hmm. which is, okay, consistent with this, but also, although sometimes it's pretty sympathetic portrayal of some of the Germans themselves, and then also kind of fools. Whereas this, in this movie, Portman in specific, he is certainly portrayed as a legitimate threat.
Right.
That by the end of the movie, you wouldn't be surprised if he'd have gotten away with it.
A very dangerous fool.
Oh, I don't know if he's ever.
I don't think he's a fool.
I
think he's very cunning and it's very smart. Yeah. But this would, and you see Olivier just like trying to reason with him or trying mm-hmm. to use logic with him. It just doesn't. With someone who's ideologically blinded, logic right. and reason is not going to go anywhere.
Well, yeah, but he doesn't. He also replies with a consistent logic on his end, right? He doesn't lose his cool.
Right.
And it's not one of those where it's portrayed as inherently ridiculous. I mean, yes, saying the Mein Kampf is your Bible is kind of patently absurd. But at the time, I can't definitively say if that would have been the normal.
Well, that would have been extremely close. I mean, I think there was. I read something somewhere where, like every other country, everywhere in the Christian world, there was like 1.7 Bibles for every
right.
person in that country, and that was no different in Germany. But in Germany, for Mein Kampf, it was like 2.5 or something. It was stupid, and you got one when you signed your register to get married.
So you
as a couple got one.
Oh,
if you were in the Hitler Youth, you were issued one. So I mean. If you're married and in the Hitler Youth, just automatically you had two. Mm-hmm. If you went to any college, I think it was like after 1935, you were given one as
right.
yeah. So
one per year,
right? So I wouldn't. Now, whether or not people read it like the Bible, that's completely different,
right? There certainly were some, and probably you would hope a vast majority who didn't.
I have a distinct feeling, and I can't back this up at all, that the most people who read Mein Kampf were people who lived outside of Germany. But that's just
my bias,
in my opinion.
Right. And this is, again, a tremendous, where the engineer, he really has a lot of misplaced confidence in himself.
Yeah. Yeah, and going back to Olivier's character, I'm just fascinated with Olivier and what he stands for and what he means and what his performance portrays. Like, it's almost like really damning of Vichy at the time. So there's a lot of politics going into it. Like, there are a lot of French in Canada who wanted nothing to do with this war. First of all, like, I'm not going to go fight for some king in some other country that I don't swear allegiance to, even though they made this deal to enter Confederacy only 50 years before. But also, like, Vichy cut a deal. Vichy surrendered. Vichy made a deal with the Nazis. They got half their country for effectively the next 2.5 years of the war. They could just rule as a dictatorship to their own will. And as far as Vichy was concerned, the war was over. They're out. So a lot of the French sympathy was, well, war's over. Why are the English still fighting? Just cut a deal with Hitler and just end the war.
And call it good. Yeah.
That was their immediate logic. And I wouldn't say that reasoning was lost either on the British public or on the Canadian public. Or, I mean, Churchill just most recently in the film, the one that Gary Oldman brilliantly played Churchill in.
Darkest Hour?
The Darkest Hour, brilliant film. They actually discussed the true reality of spending an entire day talking about, well, what will this mean if we actually do cut a deal with him? What does this mean short term for Britain and long term for the world and our empire? And they decided at the end of it not to do it. And it raises very, very distinct problems. You know, the United States still had an embassy in Paris, or rather in Vichy, to deal with the Vichy French, and the British were constantly effing up that relationship that we had with the French until Pearl Harbor, and then everything was just crystal clear. And so for a French Canadian to go see this movie and see Olivier's, like, they might be offended that Olivier's playing the role, but to them they would either starkly disagree with it or find a lot in common with his point of view. And I haven't seen his other films of the era, Henry V and Hamlet, and he did a lot of Shakespeare during this time.
I think I have seen the Henry V.
That was on Criterion, I think, in the 90s.
I had the Laserdisc, I believe. But that's irrelevant. I mean, I had seen that, but again, it's been so long that it's not that ingrained in my memory at this moment.
When he picks up that accordion and starts playing it, I'm like, okay, plaid shirt, accordion, all he needs now is a mime. It's interesting. Portman goes on a while about racial disparity and racial inequality. And it's interesting to think, I mean, this is 80 years after the war. Things are just different now. But, you know, my grandfather fought in the war. He was in the 2nd Infantry Division, and he fought in Normandy, D-Day plus 22, all the way to Battle of the Bulge, and he was evacuated after he was wounded. But my grandfather was from West Texas, and he was a prejudiced man. And that's no different than anyone else who was prejudiced during the 1930s or 40s or 50s. That was just the world that they lived in. It's no excuse.
Yeah,
it just is what it is.
Right.
But even to my grandfather, the Germans were out of whack.
Oh, yeah.
Like, even to my grandfather, they were white supremacists and they were Aryans. And it was very strange listening to someone who was prejudiced saying the Germans were just way, way, way.
Right. I mean, I would imagine, not having met your grandfather, would be like, you know, I don't like these people, but, you know, whatever, as long as they, you know, keep on their end of the world and I keep on mine, we're all good. Right. Where it's a lot different than we're going to systematically destroy these people.
Yeah.
You know, there is a definite difference between disliking people and hating them so much.
Segregation and genocide. Yeah.
Right. There are these differences, you know, and people who are prejudiced are sometimes completely illogical and crazy, but oftentimes they're not, and they just don't consider being wrong per se. You know, but I've got a black friend, right? It's like, that doesn't mean you're.
What does that mean?
Yeah, it's like, okay, you got a friend, congratulations. But it's just one of those where, almost no matter where you sit on the spectrum, as long as you're not on that far end, where it's like, Jews, get rid of them, and the Catholics, let's get rid of them too, and you know,
Well, well, I think it was past. I don't know. It wasn't Niemöller. I don't remember who it was, but it's that famous phrase. They came for the communists, and I wasn't a communist, so I didn't care. And then they came for the socialists, and I didn't care. And then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't care. And then they came for the Jews, and I didn't care. And then they came for me,
and then I cared a little bit.
And there was no one who cared.
Right. And this is a fairly vicious attack that really establishes the enemy as very much immoral.
Absolutely. Just mowing these people down in cold blood.
In the back.
Yeah.
It really establishes them as people to hate.
And it's actually, at the time, this is very strange to say, this is actually very forward of British cinema to acknowledge. There was an initial ethnic cleansing in Poland, which happened in September, October, and November of 1939 during the occupation, the battle and the occupation of that country. But after that, largely, it stopped. And it stopped because now there was a German civilian authority in place that took over after the Wehrmacht. They divided the areas of occupied Poland, and then they instituted the labeling of Jews, the segregation of Jews, and the ghettoization of Jews, and they created a separation that they thought was going to be permanent. So this is based on, so far, since they shot this in the spring and the summer of 1940, so far it's based on those early activities that they knew that were happening in Poland at the time.
Mm-hmm.
The invasion of the Soviet Union isn't for another year.
Right.
And the war, like was said, it actually doesn't start until May of 1940. And even during the invasion of France, although you had sporadic war crimes all throughout the war, there was only really one instance where there was one village in France that was just wiped off the face of the planet during that invasion. Other than that, the Germans were known as like these gangster politicians, but the army itself was not known as this tool of racist genocide.
Right. It was just very effective and scary soldiers.
Right. So I would say that scene of just wiping out the Inuits really evokes a lot like this. Take the damn queen down, the king and the queen.
But it's also one of those things where, they're obviously trying to stop the pilots.
Right.
And just everybody else gets mowed down as well. So I don't think it was necessarily presented as a focused attempt to eliminate the Inuits exclusively.
Well, it could have been something that just got out of hand.
Right.
It just started as one thing and
but
just
it is
went
one
to
of those,
another.
Yeah, but it's one of those where, okay, here's innocence, and it does a good job of really having the audience dislike. Not that you would think you would need a lot of motivation, but it is one of those where it certainly does it as well.
Yeah. And I found it fascinating because, you watch it once and it's sort of, they're clearly establishing lines.
Mm-hmm.
But then you watch it again and you start seeing like this morality involved in it that it's like it's layered.
Yeah,
like
it's
parallel morality.
Right.
It's deeper.
It's actually, it is a fairly deep movie in that regard.
Which again is surprising for
for when you hear propaganda film, you imagine a very basic.
Well, I would say that if people say propaganda film, just immediately what movie comes to your mind?
Actually, for me,
yeah,
it's the Bugs Bunny cartoon. Those are the ones where I think propaganda. Where
the war cartoons?
With the war cartoons. That's usually what I do.
Okay, what's the second film that comes to mind?
I'm totally blanking. What?
Triumph of the Will.
Oh, well, yes.
I mean, that Riefenstahl is immediately what comes to mind.
No, it's a legit point, and I'm just dumb.
The scene that we passed, this is brilliant. Like these shots, it's almost like a documentary style of the Inuit taking the rifle and hiding behind the rock.
And I thought it was, definitely put there on purpose where he is the one who meets out his justice.
Right. Right. Just a crack shot. It's almost shot like a Western there.
Yeah, it's very much. Which is probably consistent with a lot of the action in movies of that time.
Well, Westerns were so predominant.
Right.
And so popular everywhere in the world. So the scene before where they were talking about, I've been a party member since 1930 something, and I thought that was very interesting, since that's actually how a lot of people rank themselves in the party.
This is how long I've been associated with these a-holes.
Right. I was a party member since 1930.
But, people do that with everything.
Yeah.
Right. I've been a member of this country club since before you were born.
I was, what's the Texas thing? The old 300.
Exactly.
I'm a descendant of the old 300. Okay.
All right, then.
That's right. My wife actually is for a very long time was a member of the DAR, the Daughters of the Revolution. And it's sort of now what's the point type of thing. And they did something recently to piss my wife off. She's like, I'm quitting that organization. But it is Hitler went to jail in 1925. He spent a year in jail, and he came out of jail, and he basically just played it cool, and his book came out, and then he became extraordinarily popular when he went on the book tour, and they had an election in 1928, and the Nazis just gained exceedingly well. And considering they were banned in 1925, right after the beer hall putsch, to go from that to winning like almost 30% in the Reichstag in 1928, it was only a 3-year period. It really took everybody by surprise. So they actually had this concept of, well, if you were a Nazi before 1928, then you're actually ideologically pure. If you're after that, it's not like you were seen as a pure or as an opportunist, but it's sort of like, well, you didn't join until after people already died.
Right.
That type of weird, bizarre situation. And there are people that joined after 1930 that you think, like Reinhard Heydrich was one of those guys. The guys who organized the Holocaust didn't join until after 1930.
Maybe they just weren't of age to be eligible to join.
I don't think they had an age.
No, I don't think so.
I think birth was perfectly acceptable to be a Nazi. The chess game, we missed the chess game too.
Yes, we did.
Your thoughts on the chess? Like, it was fairly obvious to me. Like, this is.
Well, what are your thoughts?
Well, it almost reminds me of that scene in The Lady from Shanghai where they had the courtroom drama was going on, and the judge says, we're going to take a break. And then you've got the members of the court walking across the courtroom, and then there's a fade out, and then it's a chess board. It's the judge playing, I think, with the defense attorney to pass the time. And it was this very, very interesting parallel where the courtroom was where the real chess game was played. Mm-hmm. And so I saw the chess game between them as, okay, well, this is a very intricate thinking game between the Allies and the Axis.
Okay. See, and yeah, I just looked at it more as of a criticism of I'm blanking on the character's name, the engineer's, ability, because he was making, not recommendations, he was directing that side, and it was just poor decision after poor decision, which is paralleled here with his overconfidence and knowing how to fly the plane and read the fuel meter and just being sloppy because he didn't know that the emergency tank was full or empty. And errors can happen in that regard, but not owning up to is, instead of saying, I don't know, being very confident, oh, yeah, I checked it, it's fine. It's like, oh, well, no, I'm wrong.
Yeah, and then the plane is overweight, and then we can't make the
right.
We don't have enough gas, and we don't. And in that way, it's almost like, I don't know if you saw Triple Frontier on Netflix.
No, I haven't seen that yet.
And Oscar Isaac. I'm not going to.
It's in my queue.
It's an excellent film.
I've heard it's quite good.
You need to see it, and that's another case where every single person who knew better deliberately made the wrong choice, and that's what I see here. Everyone. Despite from the German side, their good intentions to survive and to go on and to spread whatever, they make absolutely the wrong decision.
Oftentimes. And the sinking, which again is actually this is a relatively terrifying sequence of them enclosed in this plane and just about drowning. And one of the actors, as I understand it, literally was drowning because he didn't know how to swim. So that sequence was doubly terrifying for that individual. It wasn't Portman. I can't remember exactly which one it was.
That horrifies me that they put an actor in the water who didn't know how to swim.
Oh, there were swimmers that were close. They had the camera right there. It's not like it was...
Yeah. Well, the Abyss, you had people in the water who were perfectly trained, and Ed Harris almost died.
Mm-hmm. And as did Cameron himself.
As did Cameron himself. That's right. One more issue that I had on the genocide theme. This was just a note that occasionally it would pop into my head, and I just can't go through it without repeating this.
Mm-hmm.
But when you went into Auschwitz as a future victim, you shed everything. You know, they took your bags, and eventually they took your clothes, and they led you into the gas chamber, and they gassed you, and then somebody else pulled you out
and took your gold teeth.
And then they took your gold teeth, and then they cremated you. And the gold teeth went into a room with all of your other stuff, your case and all of your clothes, and all of that was sorted through by a select few chosen Jews
Mm-hmm.
in a building that was near the entrance, and that's where they went through all the money and all the gold teeth, and if they found anything in your luggage, the books, or if you had an heirloom lamp or spectacles, and it was seen as this room where this untold wealth was taking place. But of course, the Germans were sorting through that, and there was grift going on. You had the guards were taking everything that they possibly could, and it was a money making machine because they had to pay the railroad back for the tickets, because the Jews were paying their own tickets to their own extermination through this process. And that room was nicknamed by the survivors who were working in Auschwitz as Canada with a K, because Canada in the Eastern European frame of mind, not just in Jews' mind, was this land of unbelievable wealth and resources. Canada was this place where everybody wanted to go. So you had everything in Canada. It was amazing. And here we are watching a film about Canada, and it does seem to be a wealth of, although primarily probably things that we wouldn't associate in that room. The people,
Mm-hmm.
the regular Canadians, the French Canadians, the Inuits, the Anglo Canadians, they seem to be the resource. The Hutterites being these very noble farmers.
Well, yeah, and they have freedom.
They have freedom,
which is the most critical thing.
It's the greatest treasure of all.
Right.
Liberty.
And it looks like the Scarecrow is giving a Heil Hitler sign.
I had never noticed that before. I think you're right, man.
It's pretty scary.
And Portman here is pretty... Just how they all stand. They all stand differently.
They all do, yeah.
And the entire movie.
They've all got different levels of confidence, or you can kind of see like that gentleman on the left who's leering just a little bit too much.
Right. With the black shirt.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the only black shirt in the movie.
Yes.
There's a... I hesitate to say this, but I feel like this I would be doing a disservice if I knew this and didn't repeat it. There are Hutterite colonies in Alberta.
Okay.
And you pass them on the way to Lethbridge or McLeod or wherever you're going, Fort McLeod. And there are two modes of thinking of the Hutterites, and there's tons of them. And they are kind of like...
I mean, they're not dissimilar from the
like,
Amish.
Yeah, not like the Amish, but, I mean, they drive cars and do things like that. But
they're very isolated by their own choice.
Very, very much so.
Their own internal economy and, culture.
And very communal like this, eating together and so forth. And
yes, the bread.
The bread. Like, give us this day. I mean, is this not the overt symbol of the moment of we are sharing our bread with these people who don't deserve it?
Right. And apparently the bread's not very good, but you know what? You take what you can get.
Yeah, the Hutterites were very content because, well, it's bread.
Mm-hmm.
And
simple needs.
Yeah, exactly.
And pretty soon we're at the introduction of Anton Walbrook, who is just phenomenal.
And he plays the bad guy in Colonel Blimp.
Not the bad guy. He's the German.
He plays the good German.
Yeah, he's the German.
Yeah, bad guys.
And he is the bad guy in the red shoes.
The ballerina director.
Correct.
Yeah. So I finally found that when I was sick and quarantined in this room over here. I watched the Red Shoes.
Gotcha. Probably not an optimal environment to watch that, but that's fine.
Suffering from COVID is not an optimal time to watch the Red Shoes.
No, when you're suffering and watching suffering, and yeah. But I do like. I mean, this right here, it really shows Vogel. Am I getting his name right? Vogel?
Yeah.
The character? How he is definitely not your stereotypical Nazi. And it is a pretty interesting portrayal. And it's pretty nuanced in that he finds all this very interesting, and he is desiring to, he's very conflicted about his role, right? At least in the beginning. He gives the rosary to the dying Olivier in an act of kindness, and then feels regret and tears the queen and digs the swastika into the wall. But you kind of get the sense that he is a man who is not happy with his spot, and obviously in this sequence they more well define that. Yeah,
well, and I think that he, again, to use a moniker I previously used, and you see it in all kinds of films, he's the good German.
Yeah, but that's one of those where, from the propaganda perspective, again, I was impressed that they would portray who would be, the enemy as a pretty sympathetic character, and at least understandable.
Right.
Right.
I certainly understand his motives here. Like, I understand wanting to serve your country. I understand being born in Germany and growing up in Germany and wanting to love Germany and serve your country. I'm patriotic too.
Absolutely.
I love this country, so I completely get that. And at what point do you have to jump off that train? At what point do you have to look at your political situation and say, this shit ain't working? There were tons of people in Germany who felt that way. There were kids in the western part of Germany, particularly in Westphalia, who just and around Hamburg and Stuttgart, who didn't want anything to do with the Nazi ideology, and they refused to join the Hitler Youth, and they formed their own bands.
That's a bad German.
Yeah.
But
it's a bad Russian.
Bad Russian, sorry. But it was just very interesting to be portrayed in what is, a classified a propaganda film.
Right. It's very nuanced. It's a very nuanced point of view.
And it's sympathetic to that specific individual. And that's the thing that struck me while watching it is there are very few, if any, true stereotypes. Right? The only stereotype I can truly think of in this movie that has aged poorly, if you will, is Olivier's, servant.
Right.
That's about the only caricature that at least we define as a caricature these days. Because here the Nazi is he's not twirling his mustache, right? And the two junior members of the crew, I mean, they are probably the closest to characters of just kind of dumb, emotional wrecks.
Tools,
if you will. But the rest of the characters are all pretty thoughtful. Even if they're objectively bad, they're given a certain degree of depth, which was refreshing and unexpected.
And it's a pretty interesting setup that Pressburger wrote all of Powell's films and was on set every day with Powell. It's almost like the Coen brothers, is what I understand of how they operated. Right?
Basically, one's really the writer, one's really the director, but they go co-credit.
Yeah, or the Wachowski brothers or sisters.
We're going to go with Wachowski brothers.
Originally. So Pressburger sets up this. First, you're introduced to Portman for about 20 minutes or so, the captain, and then you're introduced to the engineer, and then you're introduced to Vogel, and you kind of just do this round robin. And so you get a feel for all the characters in turn. And
they're all given their time.
Right.
They're not nameless, faceless.
Right.
On either the good side or the bad.
And this is probably the third or fourth. I've probably seen 3 or 4. 49th parallel. One of our aircraft is missing. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp.
Red Shoes.
The Red Shoes. I've seen one more. Black Narcissus.
Yeah, I haven't seen Black Narcissus.
Oh
yet.
my God,
I just haven't watched it yet.
Genius.
Oh yeah,
genius.
I know. Yeah. Don't make me feel bad on your podcast.
So I've seen like 5, and this is like a 10-year period. I think Black Narcissus is 1950 or 1949 or something. I think I got a handle on an Archer film, and I'm not. It looks like an Archer film. It feels like an Archer film.
There's definitely a certain identifiable style.
Yeah, despite the fact that it's black and white. Because when you think of Archer films, you just immediately think Technicolor.
Right?
Particularly Black Narcissus, which is like just
In red shoes,
really
doesn't matter.
powerful.
Right.
I got problems with red shoes.
That's fine. We'll discuss it later.
Yeah. Heil Hitler.
Good night, John Boy.
With no pants on.
Yes, I thought that was comical.
I mean, that must be on purpose, but I don't know. I didn't live in the 40s.
No. I mean, he's got his jacket on, what appears to be his jacket. Maybe it's just a heavy flannel, but...
Well, it's cold up there.
I was about to say, it's cold. They didn't have a heater. I don't see a fire burning.
So I was going to finish my thought on the Hutterites. There are two modes of thoughts, which where we look at Hutterites like the Amish and so on and so forth, and they're fine. They're just separate. They just got their own thing. There are Ukrainians in Alberta too, Ukrainian settlements where they still spoke Ukrainian, not Russian, Ukrainian. And Ukrainian dance was actually like a class that you could take in high school, and just like the Highland dance in some schools that we have today, and it was remarkably positive, I would say. And then you had these other Canadians who would tend to be more prejudiced, who would look at the Hutterites basically like Europeans looked at gypsies.
Okay. Like
they're thieves, lock your car when you're going through their towns, try not to associate with them. And I found it kind of, for lack of a better phrase, very un-Canadian how some Canadians thought about them. It was very, very discriminatory.
Yeah, but I would imagine it's one of those things where all those things are based on somebody's experience.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And then all of a sudden the legend becomes truth.
Right. And then one thing leads to another, and then you're,
next thing
stitching stars on their jackets.
Yeah, I mean, in the grossest, most over the way top. Yeah,
right. Well, they're already together. All we have to do is hurt them, and
makes life a lot easier.
Right. I just saw this as like a complete overreaction of this guy helping out with the bread. And it was sort of, let's freak out because he's helping out with the bread.
Well, you think they aren't freaking out at that point because he's helping out. They're freaking out because he's gone, right? And are they terrified that he has left, or is it a function of, okay, we actually are in a dangerous environment with people we think are our allies?
Well, I mean, they are an enemy country.
They are, but they also are tending to identify the Hutterites as fellow Germans, right? Which is one of those where it's kind of nice and open of him, and also incredibly foolhardy, especially by Portman, is his character rather.
Yeah,
in trying to convert them to the proper way of thinking, in his mind.
Certainly. Officers in the Wehrmacht were responsible for the ideological health of their troops. It was different in, say, the Soviet Union, the Red Army, which just says it all, Red Army,
right?
Where you had a political commissar who was in a separate chain of command and attached to units and responsible for the ideological health of that unit. The political commissars were deemed so dangerous that during the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler actually singled them out of in battle or in any form, anytime you come across a commissar. He had a specific order for it, the Commissar Order of 1941. You will immediately execute all of these people for Bolshevik ideas. And oddly enough, the Nazis never did that. And I think it might be because the Wehrmacht was something that had existed before the takeover. And everyone who ran the Wehrmacht had fought in the First World War under the Imperial Army. And maybe that just wasn't possible. He didn't do it in the Luftwaffe either. But like I said, that was an ideological tool.
Right.
From birth. So this just looks like idyllic. This looks like, I don't want to say a Norman Rockwell painting, but it does look.
You could see why it would be incredibly appealing.
Yeah. And notice nobody's tired.
Everybody's happy.
No one's smiling. And that looks like a lot of work.
But when you work together,
it
lessens the load for all.
It's like that scene in Witness.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen Witness with Harrison Ford? Yeah, we got a barn to build and a day to do it. Get your ass out here, And they did it.
But yeah, amber waves of grain.
Yeah. Very similar, and of course the goatee, very similar to Oh, by the way, the few Hutterites that I did meet, and I did meet a few, again in southern Alberta, where K.D. Lang is actually from Lethbridge in southern Alberta. They're all, without exception, all of the males were wearing overalls.
Yeah, they're very consistent. Did they also have the rope belt? I don't know why you'd have the rope belt with the overalls.
I don't remember the rope belt. But oddly enough, I ran into one in Tim Hortons. We had a lovely conversation, and I don't remember what the conversation was about, but it was like he was ordering like an ice cap in Tim Hortons. It was like, wow, and he had a wallet.
Yeah.
And it's just not traditionally what you would think of. Hutterites have wallets, they buy Tims, just like all other Canadians.
How else am I going to carry my money around? It's like, I thought
you have money?
You didn't trade a chicken?
You're not like making coins out of wood? Or...
He's like, no.
Oh, you're a human being. Oh, you're a person with real things.
Yeah. Okay. We haven't completely rejected your society. We just don't want to be 100% involved. And he kind of a foreshadowing there. It looks like it might be rain or a storm is coming. I can't remember the exact phrase.
Oh, I thought that was great foreshadowing.
Yeah, but I mean, it's kind of obvious. Yeah. But it is one of those where it's like, oh, yeah, I get it. And this is really a tremendous writing on.
Oh, we are Germans.
Yeah, just both sides of this conversation. You know, they're both powerful. They're both. You could see where it would be compelling to the target audience. You know, Portman's to the Hutterites that he thinks he can sway, and the response of the denouncing of the whole ideology is. It's really well done, and this is kind of the centerpiece of the movie when I saw it, this is where it really went from, yeah, this is pretty good, to, oh my gosh, this is pretty excellent.
There's lots of things to unpack in this speech, and I thought the speech was just given so magnificently with a lightning behind him, and you've got this push in on this girl here, like, the things that you're saying completely conflict with everything I've been taught since I was a child. Mm-hmm. You know, that's what I read on her face. Like, but he might be reading
as adoration.
She's right.
It's like, oh, I'm really swaying this one.
Right.
Without, not recognizing your audience, I think, is the phrase there.
Yeah.
Considering her personal history with the Nazis in specific.
But it does convey into this great fear, particularly in British and Canadian society, of the theory of the Quisling, right? So Vidkun Quisling was this guy in Norway who was a fascist sympathizer, and when Germany invaded Norway, he led a native Norwegian movement to help the Nazis take over the government.
Right.
And then he became the fascist dictator of Norway under Nazi occupation. And it had happened so fast that it scared the shit out of the British. They're like, holy shit, that could happen here. Mm-hmm. And there's a guy.
There's always lunatics.
There's always. And there was a fascist union in Britain, and I can't remember the guy who ran it, but they locked him up.
Said, nah.
And they banned his political party, and then he tried to squeak in the 50s. After he got out of jail, he tried to reorganize this fascist movement.
Was that not terribly successful?
It was horribly successful and horribly inefficient, and didn't go anywhere. But Oswald Mosley actually was his name. Now
that actually sounds familiar. That does sound familiar.
And again, there was another one in Canada, and the great fear, and particularly when you look at what happened to the French government of how Pétain had taken over, and then all of a sudden there are all these French that are just willing to go along with the occupying forces. Like, where the fuck did these people come from? Yeah, we're just at war with these people.
Well, I mean, the exact same thing happened in Germany.
Yeah, well, they called it the fifth column, right? Because there's 4 columns normally in a marching army. So the fifth column is that one that is subversive and takes over from
pretty insidious
underneath. And like I was saying, the Bund in America, they were seen as the fifth column in the United States. And there was one in Canada. So I could almost see this as a reassuring of telling Canadians, like, look, you've got a lot of Germans in Canada.
Yep.
And the great majority of them are not interested at all.
Yeah, I mean,
in this idea.
In the immigrants here portraying as finding this home that may present its own challenges, but
right.
their freedom in Peter's speech here. Like I said, I find this just a remarkable performance by Walbrook, and just the writing to be way on point. I think this is...
And I saw it very comparable to something that a lot of Americans, even today, are still, this being 2020, it's like the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower Compact. And, the Mayflower Compact is just like beaten into you as a child, and at least in my grade school, of, hey, we fled persecution and we're here to live together. And that's what I saw in this scene is like a Canadian style of the Mayflower Compact.
Which is, it's not a shocker when you think about it for a second, but, we're also very centric on ourselves. It's kind of initially surprised, like, what do you mean it's a land of opportunity and freedom in Canada? It's never the way I've envisioned it.
No, it was just someplace that was cold.
It was cold with hockey. Everybody has a stick. It can't be friendly. I don't get it. No, but I mean, it is, and this is one of those where it really does also speak to what I would imagine their perception of the American viewing audience would be. This is consistent with traditional American ideals, at least the way they're always presented, right? And it's real effective.
I'm going to try this chocolate stout.
It is Mexican hot chocolate inspired. Stone Brewing. A pretty darn consistent good beer maker.
That Carbach chocolate stout was awesome. I haven't been through Anton Walbrook's filmography.
Nor have I. I'm not that familiar with it beyond these films. At least, I've never really registered him as it's like, ooh, he's one of the greats. But, you look at these performances and it's like, he's kind of one of the greats, at least at that particular time.
I was really unfamiliar with him until the 49th Parallel.
Yeah, I was too.
And I didn't even know he was in Blimp until
subsequent, watch right then.
Well, I was reading it.
Oh, okay.
I was reading on the 49th Parallel. I was also in Colonel Blimp. I've also seen that. What did he play in that? He was the good German.
And actually the wisest character of the whole bunch.
Here's Kelly McGillis. Little inside joke. So that's a light switch on the wall, the old style.
Yeah. Which is actually, I assume that's consistent with reality at the time.
I've never been into a Hutterite colony, but I would imagine that they're using tractors. And they're not against any of that. They're just communal.
Because you're right.
They probably even have TVs. So the escape attempt where he mentions he wants to get onto a ship in Vancouver and stow away to Japan.
Yep. So
Japan signed a tripartite act with Italy and Germany before the war. And so in theory, if they make it to Japan,
then they might as well be re-entering Germany.
They might find a way back into Germany. But the world being so divided at war, like I don't know how successful that would be. It just seems like a stretch. And again, also thinking this is after the outbreak of the war. This is before the fall of France.
Mm-hmm.
This is before the entry of America into the war. Was Canada still trading with Japan? Well, Japan didn't invade any of Britain's colonies in East Asia until December 7th. They hit like 10 places on the same day. Hong Kong was one of them. Singapore. So it's, in theory, I suppose you could find passage from Japan to Germany. But after Pearl Harbor, Canada wanted nothing to do with Japan.
Right.
And this is a good time to bring up the Canadian effort in the Second World War was pretty much unparalleled by any Commonwealth nation that was under the British flag, save probably only the Australians, who were probably like a third. The Canadians sent 5 full armies to Europe. One of them actually went to North Africa and fought with a shitload of Australians. And then on D-Day, 2 of the beaches were taken by the Canadians, who then fought all the way through the Falaise Gap and all the way into Germany. And there's this conception of Canadians being this very, I don't want to say laissez-faire, but rather relaxed people and so on and so forth. But if you look between 1898 and 1952, they fought like 5 wars.
Right.
And since then, like they didn't fight in Vietnam, but under what's his name, Pearson, who was prime minister for a time, they got heavily involved in the UN, and Canadian peacekeepers have been like this enormous influence as a peacekeeping army all over the world. And for the last 20 years, they've been pretty much occupying 1/3 of Afghanistan. And when I lived in Canada, there was a shot record by a Canadian sniper broke the Allied record in Afghanistan. I think it was like 3,000 yards or something like that. It was like a mile and a half or whatever. And I did it with a Barrett, a 50 caliber Barrett rifle, blew the guy's backpack off. And it's like, oh, the wind is wrong. Self-corrected, and then took out the guy, which I'm sure with a 50 caliber was not a pretty sight.
No, I would imagine.
But that made the news in Canada. And then the minute it came out, they suppressed it because there's this idea of, well, Canadians are not overtly killers. They're not there to kill people. But I don't have a problem with that. If that guy was a Taliban, he's an enemy. Yeah.
Right.
By all means. But take his fucking head off.
I mean, political wars are probably much more important to the effort than the actual.
It is. But they've got a great history of peacekeeping. They got a great history of succeeding in warfare. They do change over time, and the Boer War and the First World War, and particularly some of the smaller activities they've been in, it was very much, well, king and country and the empire is going, and we are a colony. But after they become a commonwealth, there's this very slow pull away from the empire. And by the time you get to the Second World War, you have Parliament in Ottawa actually waiting, I think, 2 full days. Okay. They didn't knee-jerk reaction of, well, we're going to declare war on Germany too. They actually waited, and they did it on purpose. They did it to let London know, we don't have to go to war. We can choose. In fact, if we choose to, halfway through this thing, we can leave.
Right.
The interesting part of it was, despite the fact that you had these divisions that were all 100% Canadian, was the Canadian Army was so multiple and so large and so influential and they had absolutely, unlike the Americans, they had absolutely no problem with integration. So you found Canadian RAF officers and Canadian Army officers integrated into the British Army. They just wore just a different uniform, and it just had a label on the top that just said Canada, and that was it. The greatest thing I saw in this recently,
problematic.
It might be, yeah.
I wouldn't want my soldiers under the control of a
foreign
government.
Power, yeah,
it's just
answerable to somebody else. But under the Allied war effort, particularly as you get into 1943, 1944, and when the Americans show up, that happens a lot. Even with in SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you had Brits answering to Americans, and Americans answering to Brits, and it was very integrated in the high command.
But they weren't always separate.
They were from separate armies. They were following a command structure that was integrated.
Right.
Yeah.
As opposed to the uniforms.
Right. So yeah, that's true. Yes.
Ooh, get to the food bar.
Yeah. I found this all fascinating of how things were done then. And I wanted to pause that and find the menu on the wall. How much was the sandwich? And what does roast beef cost back then? And there's a lot of that in, if you ever get a chance, The Plot Against America, which is on Amazon Prime.
Oh, okay. I've heard the name, but I don't know a darn thing about it.
Yeah, it's a series based on, well, what if Lindbergh had run in the 1940 election and won?
Okay.
Which was Roosevelt's third election, which everyone was saying, he shouldn't be running.
He probably shouldn't be doing. This seems like a long time.
Right. And he did, and he won, and I think I already said he won against Alfred Smith, who was the Catholic Republican nominee. But it's based on America, 1940. War is already broken out, and the Jews in America are already scared. And what does it mean when you have an anti-Semite like Lindbergh, who was a very popular Republican, win that election?
Yep, 45 cents.
Yeah, there we go. Sliced ham with new potato salad, 35 cents. Fried ham and egg, 30 cents. Done. I'll take 3.
Yeah, but tomato and bacon is 30. That's kind of shocking.
Oh, yeah.
I guess bacon.
So anyway, that movie looks like they shot it in 1940 in color. Like it's or that series rather. It's very, very well put together, and you do see things in the background. And obviously, they would have had to fact check it.
I would imagine so. Right.
And it's interesting to look at. Winona Ryder is in it. If you
she?
ever need
I've
an
heard of
impetus
her.
to watch anything, just say Winona Ryder's in it. And John Turturro. And this, I guess this is like a sausage, like a kolache.
Yeah, I was about to say, it looks like a
say.
kolache. I don't know if it would be.
We
but
say
it could
kolache because in Texas, Czechs are so prevalent. So we call it, even though a sausage and bread is not really a kolache as far as Czech culture is concerned, but it's bratwurst. Best bratwurst I ever had was in Germany. There is my wife and I went to a German Alpine restaurant that's over here in Santa Fe. That's pretty good. Had some liverwurst.
Interesting.
Tomato and bacon.
Yes, that's the one that I saw.
Sliced chicken and lettuce, 35
cents. Yeah.
I thought
here
this
we go,
was
just some nice, friendly Canadians
Yeah,
traversing the land.
going to Winnipeg, which is another Canadian joke. Going to Winnipeg. It's a commercial up there. Rapid City.
Isn't Medicine Hat shown on here somewhere?
Yeah, Medicine Hat, Alberta. I've been to many times.
Although there was Indian Head.
Yeah, that's another one. Head smashed in, Buffalo Jump.
I've heard
another great town. An indigenous town, First Nation town.
Not Indian?
Not Indian.
But even though they have a town called Indian
Regina.
Head. But they had the Moose Jaw.
Moose Jaw, yeah. Huge railroad junction in Moose Jaw. Oil fields all over Moose Jaw. This just looks like the most. This
reminds me a lot of what Hitchcock eventually used for North by Northwest.
Yeah,
right there.
I was just thinking of North by Northwest. All of this was shot in Alberta. I found it astounding that anyone would ever think to walk from Winnipeg to Saskatoon to Calgary like that.
That's a hike.
That's like 1,000 miles.
Yeah,
that's insane.
It's pretty ambitious.
Yeah. We're not talking about walking from Houston to San Antonio. You could probably do that in a couple of days. Like if you really put your mind to it.
It'd be a long hike.
Yeah.
But you could probably get it done in what?
Oh, yeah.
3, 4,
so if you think
3?
Caesar's legions were marching 20 miles a day. Okay. So if you think it's 300 miles roughly.
Yeah, you're probably
looking
at
4 or 5 days.
Weeks.
Yeah, but you can't fucking do Winnipeg to Calgary. Like, that's I'd shoot myself. And they have Canadian jokes about the plains of the farmer in Saskatchewan whose wife left him, and he cried for 3 days because he kept at no point in time over that 3-day period did his wife ever leave his vision because it's so flat. So he's still crying after 3 days. He still sees his wife, but she's on the horizon. Okay, horizon's like 60 miles away, not 15.
Now, is that Banff right there?
That's Banff National Park. Yeah. So this is the Canadian Pacific Railway going into Banff, so this is the not front range. It's just past Canmore, heading into Banff townside, and I drove that route every month for about 7 years. And it's the train station in Old Town Banff.
Certainly is lovely, even in black and white.
Oh, it's just gorgeous. And the Canadian Pacific had these. So this is Banff Avenue Bridge that's across the Bow River. And the Banff Springs Hotel is to the left, and the Fairmont Hotel is to the right. Kirby came up to see us one year, and he stayed there.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an actual parade of First Nations that Powell shot while he was there. And then, of course, you have the introduction of the Mountie, the quintessential Canadian. which is now today seen as a kind of a racist image.
What, a Mountie?
Yeah.
Why is a Mountie seen as something of a racist?
The RC, well,
and who is actually thinking it's racist?
In the 1800s, the Mounties were used to suppress the First Nations in a very very much an Andrew Jackson type of resettlement way. And so there's a really, really bad history in between the RCMP and all of the First Nations. And I wouldn't say that the past 10 years under this glorious liberal leader of Justin Trudeau has alleviated that image at all. In fact, Trudeau has probably just given them almost carte blanche to keep doing a lot of what they have been doing, which has been arresting natives without cause on reservations. Their abuse of power is becoming more and more a problem, or some would say it's always been a problem. We're just learning about it. But for probably a century or more, it's been the image of law and order in Canada.
Right. Which is the way I've always perceived it myself.
Sure, the honorable, upstanding. Actually, my wife and I took a vacation to Halifax around 2000, 2001. We stayed in New Brunswick and went to PEI. We had a great time all around the Atlantic provinces, and we saw this hysterical commercial that was on, and it was this American in 1898 who's going up to the Yukon. Mm-hmm. So he landed in Skagway, Alaska, and he did that trek up, with the mules and everything. And he's at the top, and then he goes into the customs office, and he comes in, and he's got the spittoon, and just acting like a complete Yank buffoon. Like, it was a complete caricature of what you would think an American would look like in that situation, behave, right? Almost out of Jeremiah Johnson. And then behind the desk is this redcoat sitting there. You're not coming into Canada, eh? You're not bringing your American ways in here. You go back down to that territory that you bought from the Ruskies. And it was so serious. It was absolutely so serious. I think it was a campaign commercial for someone who was running for office.
Really?
And we sat there and laughed at it for like an hour. And it was the whole week we were in Halifax. We're like, you're not bringing your Yankee ways in here, eh? It was really, really funny. Powell's so good with the character studies here.
Watching the sailors kind of lose their nerve and freak out just a little bit.
The Mountie always gets his man.
Yep. It's very consistent.
Dudley Do right there.
And then there are two.
In some of those scenes in the background, you can actually see Sulphur Mountain, which overlooks Banff. I've been to Banff so many times I can't count. We used to sit in restaurants and just look out at Sulphur Mountain. I've climbed Sulphur Mountain. They've got a gondola that goes up to that ridge. That's a very distinctive mountaintop that you pass on your way in.
Okay. So definitely all shot on location.
Oh, yeah.
Which, yes, I know that it was.
I mean, that's the valley that goes into British Columbia. If you were to look at that valley now, there's this enormous cut right through the center, and it's the Highway 1. And if you've ever been there, you can see the absurdity, even now, of running into the forest to escape. It would be weeks before you hit the border. And then it would be weeks more before you found a road or a town.
You would definitely starve to death or be eaten by a bear.
You would be like Lewis and Clark walking through. It would just be, unless you're Bear Grylls, you die. This is more chopped up in terms of the mountain ridges in the background. This looks more like Yoho, but I could find nothing in anything that I read that it was shot anywhere near Yoho. That is not Lake Louise. I don't know where that is. It looks a little bit like Emerald Lake, which again is in Yoho. That's Lake Minnewanka, which is just 15 minutes from Banff. And my brother and I fished there when he came up in 2012.
And dumb question, because I've never been there. This is that's a national park.
That's inside Banff National Park. Yes. Yeah. So the Canadian Rockies north of the border are pretty much divided between two huge national parks in Alberta. One is Banff National Park in the bottom, and the one north is Jasper National Park, which is closer is the wrong word, but I would say more in the direction of Edmonton.
Mm-hmm.
And then across the Continental Divide is where British Columbia starts, and that's where you have Yoho National Park and then Glacier National Park, which actually goes into the United States. It's
yes, familiar with Glacier.
Similar, and that's where the Going to the Sun Road is.
And the introduction of Leslie Howard.
Yeah.
Who I can't tell you how surprised I was when I realized that his character was not supposed to be an American.
Really?
Oh, I was convinced of it. I really thought that this was...
them crossing over and then running
No. I thought he was an American actually vacationing up there.
Oh, okay.
Because in some ways, he kind of fits what I would imagine a stereotype of a somewhat erudite and sort of silly, American would be like. Kind of...
Erudite is a good word.
Oh, thank you. But it's one of those where he's seemingly unaware of the dangers.
Aloof?
Yeah. Well, not aloof, because he's definitely getting engaged.
Right.
But it's one of those where he's just blindly unaware and so optimistic, it's sort of silly. Right? Yeah. And that's kind of where I was really surprised, because I didn't think that this was, they put an American here, because he's kind of a foolish, goofy character who then turns. Right, and as I looked at that, knowing this was a propaganda piece, that I was going, well, that's really clever if they're speaking to the American population. But it applies to any nationality that he is, and it turns out he's really Canadian.
Yeah,
which, like I said, I was kind of disappointed. That's what I thought it was, but
he was a huge international star.
He was ginormous.
Yeah.
He was.
You know what movie? Just like he was already famous throughout the 1930s. He lived and worked in Hollywood, but you know what movie that he was just super famous for being by the time this came out?
Well, tell me. Gone
with the Wind.
Yeah. I knew it was Gone with the Wind.
Ashley Wilkes and Gone with the Wind.
I didn't know if you were going to come on.
Everybody in the United States knew who Leslie Howard was.
Oh, yeah. He was
everybody did.
Probably the biggest star at that particular time.
Probably in America, I guarantee you he was more famous than Olivier.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
There's no doubt. There were people that went to see Gone with the Wind 2-3 times just to see him, and his character dies 2/3 the way through the film. Spoilers. But he was deliberately chosen by Powell because of that exposure in him. Because he knew that if they put Leslie Howard on the bill,
people would see it.
Americans would go.
Yeah. But you can see the contempt.
Yeah.
That
Philip Armstrong Scott. I mean, that just sounds like a British name. Or an American name.
It struck me as, very American.
Very American name.
It just did.
It's not like an archer symbol in the background. There's two of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like a proto-archer symbol.
Yep. Or they're a big fan of mechanicals, and that's a gear.
Now, I do have to ask, and I don't mean to be, coy or anything about it, but who the fuck is keeping Picassos in their teepee in the middle of a forest?
Leslie Scott!
Leslie Scott.
He's that kind of guy. Leslie Howard. I don't know why I said Leslie Scott.
Oh, it's Philip Armstrong.
Yeah.
Armstrong Scott.
That's what it is.
I mean, I saw that as like...
But that's also one of the things, like I said, I was just reading too much into it. That's why I thought he was American, because it's like, I could see kind of a subtle criticism of Americans not recognizing the value of the items that they have.
Oh, for sure.
So that's kind of why I thought this was. And
Okay. And here he is reading about the natives.
Mm-hmm.
And how he's fascinated with the natives. And to the Nazis, they're not worth being fascinated about.
Well, yeah, and then he doubly insults them by comparing their behavior to some of the more ruthless of the First Nations.
Right.
Okay.
Right. That's right. Well, you're not in Canada. You can say Indian.
I know. Just one of those. I wanted to stay consistent.
And here's, the Nazi wants the cold shower.
Right. He is so rigid.
Yeah.
And uncompromising. I know here's something good, but I purposely choose against it. And it's actually one of the few laughs after that since the Olivier part, where there's some actual obvious humor at play.
Yeah. Every year in Calgary, the entire city shuts down for about 2 weeks, and they have Stampede.
Right.
And Stampede is
something of a big deal, as I understand.
It is It is crazy. It is absolutely crazy. That city, it's like they're the closest thing that I can associate it to is the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo, which I've been to every year that I've lived in Houston, and Houston has one for 2 weeks, and we held it in the Astrodome, and now it's in the same compound, Reliant. And it's always packed and it's always busy. Now, I would say that the attendance to the rodeo is way, way more than, say, Stampede. Okay. So let's just throw some numbers out there that are probably wrong. If 300,000 people are going to Stampede every day, it wouldn't surprise me if it were 500,000 at the rodeo. But that's strictly because of the population of the city of Houston. Right. In Calgary, there's only 1.1 million people.
So they have
But if you talk to anybody, it just seems like everybody goes. Like it's probably like 70 or 80% of the population of Calgary goes to see Stampede. And so anyway, where I was going with that was on the back entrance off the subway. No, it's not a subway; it's a light rail. I think it's the Victoria Station. The entire back entrance is a compound of First Nations.
Okay,
it's entirely devoted to the Crowfoot and the Blackfoot tribes, teaching you how they lived before the white man showed up, or even during the colonial era and into the 1800s. And they have real teepees built by real natives, and they could adjust them, and it was amazing to learn how they developed things like the heat flaps, and you could have fires inside, and it really reminded me of what I learned in history class about the Mongolian yurts.
Okay.
And how the Mongols just took their yurts everywhere. They conquered everything. Very, very similar. And of course, they had classes that lasted for about 50 minutes. And you could just go in and whenever you wanted to, just walk through. And it was utterly fascinating. So I understand how someone like George Armstrong Scott or whatever, Philip Armstrong Scott could really just like deep dive into this and get lost
and adopt it. Yeah,
for sure. In his Western clothes and his ascot.
Oh yes, he is
sweater.
He is very civilized.
Reading Thomas Mann.
Yes, he is sort of like Niles Crane, gone wilderness.
Yes, if Niles Crane lived in the Adirondacks,
this would be him.
Would be Leslie Howard. Yeah.
And it's strange. I can't remember the character's name. I apologize. The remaining German crew member.
Nazi. The last Nazi.
The crewman, though.
Yeah.
Is it just me, or does he look very much like Sheldon from The Big Bang? I know we're going way off the rails on that one.
Sheldon seems more sophisticated. Sheldon's character, by the way, is also from Texas. Him, yeah.
What, the actor?
Yeah.
Yeah, the actor, he went to Klein High School.
He went to Klein. Oh, yeah. No shit.
Jim Parsons?
Yeah, Jim Parsons.
I think that's the name.
I saw the Big Bang set when I was in Warner Brothers a few years ago. It would shock you how just terribly small that is.
Oh, no, I saw what did I see? I saw the Larry Sanders Show when I was in L.A.
Yeah.
And that's just, it's a good introduction to, you have these visions of things being
enormously
big and spacious,
large.
And they so are not.
It's a fucking dream factory, that Hollywood place, I tell you.
Illusion.
It's amazing what they do. Magical.
But where did the lighter fluid come from?
It's funny. He's reading the Thomas Mann book. They make a lot of fuss about Thomas Mann.
Mm-hmm.
They kicked him out. The Nazis, they got rid of him. But it's funny that Hirth, that's his name.
It is Hirth. You're right. Yeah.
He mocks Leslie Howard for reading Thomas Mann. Mann wrote about the mountains and nature and how they were part of being German. And I thought that was weird because the Nazis were actually huge naturalists. They really dug the Berg films from the 20s and 30s. Leni Riefenstahl was in a lot of those Berg films. Not the Blue Angel, that was Dietrich. The Holy Mountain.
Okay.
The Weimar Berg films.
You can have a great love for the outdoors and a great love for killing people. They are not mutually exclusive.
Well, that's the great. I don't want to say irony, maybe coincidence is a better word, but that's something that people have always been trying to reconcile. Was, you had Strauss and all these, and Goethe and all these brilliant German thinkers and minds for hundreds of years, and at the peak of German power is when you have this horrible catastrophe. No one's ever been able to reconcile that. It's just a fact that you had both. You had brilliant German minds that perpetrated this thing.
Yeah, but couldn't you look at that phenomenon as kind of a microcosm of the human species?
Yes.
I mean, capable of so much and so much on opposite ends. It's just the eternal conundrum.
Genghis Khan built the world's largest empire.
And was
period.
Was an objectively terrible person.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And
how
many artists do you have that create remarkable pieces of art, but are just reprehensible human beings? It's that kind of, yin yang, black and white side of the coin, Harvey Dent, if you will. It's just reality. It's just life.
You mean that people are nuanced? Human beings?
Some are.
People?
Some are.
Just like this film.
Yes, exactly. Which is why, like I said, I was very impressed watching it, walking in with the knowledge that it was a propaganda film, but not being, like I said, Bugs Bunny
right
in his cartoon adventures.
I did read in one of the books that I read. His name escapes me right now. I'll put the names to all the books that I read for this in the notes. But there were a lot of reviews in Britain when this came out in October of 1940.
And I assume this was a very well-reviewed film.
It was. October of 1940.
41?
41. Yeah, October 1941. It was a very well-reviewed film. It was almost universal. People loved it. But they did write that they found Leslie Howard's erudite character a sad repetition of, like, if you were to paint a picture of what a Brit was in 1930 or 1940 rather, it would be him.
Right.
It would be this dude in an ascot, wearing a wool sweater, in a teepee, reading Thomas Mann, talking about his Picassos. Just sophisticated Etonian or Oxfordian.
Inherently silly.
And yes, and in a very, like, if Monty Python was actually serious.
Right.
It would look like Philip Armstrong Scott. So there was that sort of, and apparently he had played this role in similar movies. And so it was getting kind of repetitive.
Yeah, and he wasn't believe he was a big fan of the roles he was getting for the most part.
During the war, you found no harder worker in the British film industry than Leslie Howard. This guy worked incessantly, and he fucking hated Nazis with a passion. He was, I read an entire chapter on Leslie Howard's pro-war activities for the British government. Who he reminds me of is Orson Welles, actually, who spent an unbelievable amount of personal coin for the Allied cause. Leslie Howard was an official, not correspondent, but I would say a personality for the BBC. He flew all over the empire pushing the cause. He was constantly in parts of Europe, North Africa, helping the troops. He went all over Canada, went all over the United States. He absolutely believed to the nth degree that the Allied cause was something that he could spend every single one of his last pennies on. He was a true British patriot. And, he, like Glenn Miller, he was returning from an activity in Spain.
Right. He was
drumming
up support.
He was drumming up support for the war in Spain. And he was shot down on his way back to Britain, and he died. And
Did you listen to the commentary track?
No, I didn't.
No, I'm really surprised because
you got an up on me for that.
Well, it was one of those that Bruce Eder, and like I said, I haven't fact checked it, but I'm going to go ahead and assume that there's some degree of truth to the anecdote. Was that he wasn't the target by any stretch, but there was somebody who resembled, and I'm blanking on the name, and I didn't write it down, somebody who resembled, I think Churchill maybe, who was in his party.
Yeah.
So there was some sort of faulty information where they thought that
They thought that was...
Right.
There might be a possibility.
Right.
Huh. Well, shit like that happens. So there was actually a film made similar to that line in the late 1970s. Treat Williams was in it. And it took place about 1943, 1944. And I think... it's more clear to me now. I'm going to have to find the name of it. Robert Duvall was in the SAS, and he recruited and sent a hit squad to Britain to go kill Winston Churchill. And the leader of the hit squad, I think, was Donald Sutherland.
This sounds familiar.
No, Donald Sutherland was like the Irish helper. Michael Caine was the leader of the hit squad, and then and Treat Williams was like the captain of a military police unit who just happened to stumble across this plot that was going to assassinate Winston Churchill. And there's this fantastic battle in the finale of the film of these Americans jumping through this like very English looking courtyard of graves, like a graveyard, into the church where Michael Caine and his Nazis are holed up, having this sort of like anthropoid type of battle. For those of you who've seen Anthropoid, which is another great movie that came out a few years ago. But regardless of that, we'll talk about it later.
Okay, never heard of
it. But it was really strange, like Robert Duvall and Michael Caine and Treat Williams and they succeeded. They killed Churchill in the car at the end, and you don't find out until after the battle when they're pulling his body out that it was a double. Mm-hmm. And Churchill actually used doubles throughout the war. He used doubles, sometimes 2 and 3. It was kind of like Saddam Hussein. Like, where's the real Saddam?
Is he? He's everywhere.
This is an excellent beer, the stout.
Yes, that is outstanding. So that's okay. So they thought possibly that Churchill was on that flight. If I'm recalling the anecdote correctly, which, like I said, I failed. I did not write it down.
That's fascinating.
Because I figured for sure you'd watch that.
But why would Churchill be coming back from Spain? I don't know if Churchill even went to Spain during the war.
Well, I don't believe... I mean, he obviously did. Or why they would have believed that...
What was Howard doing in Spain?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, Spain was a hotbed of political intrigue during the war.
Well, in 1943, right, that's when he died. Mm-hmm. Right, what was Spain... what was the situation in Spain at that point?
Well, Spain, since the end of Spanish Civil War in 1938, 1939, early 1939, Spain was run by a fascist regime under General Franco. Yeah. But during the opening of the war in 1939, even into 1940, Hitler actually took a train with the leadership of the Nazi regime all the way down to Spain, and they held like a conference in Madrid for an entire day where he tried to convince Franco to come into the war. And Franco basically said no. And the reason Franco said no was because, believe it or not, I don't know how much common knowledge this is, but the leader of the Abwehr, which is the German Navy intelligence system, like their spy network, like we would say the CIA or MI6, or in American during wartime, it was the OAS, the Office of OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. It was actually the Abwehr. It was in the Navy, and the guy who ran that was the guy named Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. And Canaris' son was a U-boat captain who had died during the Battle of the Atlantic, and he turned and started feeding the Allies information. I mean, this is extraordinary. The leader of the intelligence network in Nazi Germany feeding the Allies information, and he actually went down there with Hitler and everybody. He had a private conversation with Franco. It said, like, if you get in this war, Spain will lose everything. And not only will it be disastrous for you, but it'll be disastrous for the next 30 years for Spain. Because this will absolutely just completely
destroy it as a nation.
Right. And if you look at what happened to Germany and Italy after the war, that's not outside the bounds of reality. So by this time, he decided to keep Spain neutral. But everyone who had an embassy had one in Madrid. And Madrid and Spain in general, and Portugal to a lesser extent, became this almost like a Casablanca type place where you had just spies freaking everywhere, like Switzerland.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's intriguing. I wonder why Howard was there. I mean, I don't think Churchill ever went to Spain during the war, but it makes me wonder why Howard was there to begin with. What the hell was he doing in Spain? Because just immediately that I just think intrigue.
Right, but
and it wouldn't surprise me. Howard was such a patriot. You know, Josephine Baker was in Paris during the entire occupation, and she very brazenly and bravely fed information from the German military to the Allies, the French resistance, and so forth. And we're getting, again, off topic.
According to Wikipedia, so take this with the largest grain of salt. One theory suggests that the Germans attacked the aircraft because they believe that British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was aboard. It doesn't necessarily say why, but it does support that story. The Libson Church route frequently carried agents and escaped POWs to Britain.
Okay. Well, yeah, everybody who had feet and was on the Allied side tried to walk to Spain so they could get out. Yeah. And Howard's line about, well, that explains everything: your arrogance, your stupidity, and your bad manners. Nazis were seen as people who had exceptionally bad manners. And they also make the comment of 11 million Canadians. To think that there's 11 million Canadians in 1940, there's 38 million Canadians now. So they've almost quadrupled their population in 80 years.
There's how many Canadians?
There's 38 million Canadians now. There are more people in Texas than there are in all of Canada. When I lived in Alberta, there were more people in Houston than there were in Alberta. There were more people on my side of town than there were in Calgary.
Unexpected.
And most Canadians live within 200 miles of the Canadian border. The 49th parallel.
I mean, that does make some degree of sense.
And so it's the second largest country on the planet, but it might as well be as thin as Chile.
Right.
That's what I read in a book by Pierre Burton.
I guess it's really no dissimilar.
It's one of those reasons why they Target opened, I don't know, like 40 stores in Canada, and they failed. They had to write off, like, I don't know what it was, like $30 billion. It was a complete failure because a lot of Canadians, they knew Target. They drove to Target.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Target's open, they were, this is really expensive shit. Why is it so expensive? Like, I've been to Target. It's just over there in Windsor. Why?
I will just go there.
Yeah, I'll just go there. I don't need a Target. Fuck this shit. It's like there's Americans coming up and trying to take my money.
And bringing their horrible ideals.
Yes. That explains everything. Their arrogance, their stupidity, and their bad manners. I liked Howard the Coward, as I called him, because they called him a coward, right?
Right.
Howard the Coward proves his bravery by walking towards the cave and getting shot. I love that scene.
I did too. I mean, that one is one of the few times where it is bordering on just plain silly.
Yeah.
But it is entertaining, and you kind of get into it and get it. I mean, it's inherently ridiculous.
It is, but it's also one of those situations, like, if I were to pick anyone out of Hollywood who would actually do that, it would probably be Leslie Howard.
Right. It's consistent with the perception.
I mean, over John Wayne. John Wayne took a deferment because he had 5 kids and took an extreme amount of shit over it.
Yeah, and if John Wayne had gotten shot, it just would have bounced off him because he's John Wayne.
I'm John Wayne.
Damn it. No limp would have happened. I mean, you're talking about a guy who crows gills and breathes like a fish.
And he says one armed Superman against one unarmed decadent Democrat.
Yep.
Death to academics. So Hearth heads to the border. So one thing that didn't make sense to me, I already talked about it, like, how are you going to get to Japan?
With Raymond Massey all of a sudden appearing.
Yeah.
But you were saying, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just trying to figure out why, if he's on his way to Vancouver, why is he backtracking to the Lethbridge, which is the other way? And then he gets on the train and supposedly goes south.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, like, if you look at how the camera rocks here, like, how did they get that that natural rocking. Obviously, this is a set, so I was just wondering, how did that happen?
I would imagine that you just have crew members who are moving the items back and forth.
And then Hirth says that, well, I'm not afraid, but then he's like hiding behind barrels.
Mm-hmm.
That's barrels of oil, I'm sure. And then, of course, there's this moment like out of Casablanca and Indiana Jones where you're going over the map. And now you're like playing with fantasy, because in no way in one night or one day you can go from Lethbridge, Alberta to Niagara Falls, Ontario. That's not happening.
Not even on a bullet train.
No, not even on a bullet train. If you drove straight, it'd be like 4 or 5 days of driving.
Yeah, it's compelling. And he certainly didn't knock him out that hard.
No. And then they are in kind of like a freight car, which is pretty haunting considering you think what Germans used freight cars. Well, they see that movement out the window. It's just very well.
It's very well done.
Thought out. It does not look like back projection. Of course, it doesn't have to be of that quality. And it's almost like Hirth kind of misses the point of why this guy is AWOL.
Mm-hmm. No, he absolutely does. He interprets it through his own, filters.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, it is. But it does show the, what's the right way to put it? The alien thought process, where he's so disconnected with the, North American, thought process on their end.
Yeah. The American turns them away because they're
not on the manifest.
Right. They're illegal immigrants. So the Canadian Andy Brock goes back to Canada. Sure to be imprisoned for being AWOL. Because he has to stop the German. He has to do the right thing.
He has to accept this punishment.
That's right.
But he has to do the right thing. And this really is an excellent sequence here at the end, where the villainous Nazi believes he has triumphed due to his devious cunning and stronger will. And it turns out, he gets turned back because of a technicality.
Yeah. The film is a heavy Niagara Falls, beautiful shot of Niagara Falls, which apparently looks like a theme park on the American side. And on the Canadian side, it looks like any neighborhood you would see anywhere in Canada. The film is a heavy attempt to write the themes of the Ministry of Information's stated propaganda goals, like I was saying at the beginning, into the products of propaganda themselves. They address what we are fighting for and why we are fighting. In so doing, they're carefully and conscientiously setting out the advantages of adhering to the democratic ideals and of following the democratic system of government. When, compared with the hardships to be endured from espousing Nazi ideology and of living under the Nazi New Order. Apart from depicting the conflict of ideas and the issues at stake, it also managed to bring in the important matter of the part played by the Dominions in the war, and incidentally, though not insignificantly, it sought to allude to the American position on the war and how they might fit in. But, surprisingly, not everybody liked this movie. I pulled a couple of movie reviews.
Mm-hmm.
Quote, on the negative side, it has been claimed that A, that we have been so conditioned by Hollywood to being on the side of the hunted rather than the hunters that there is bound to be some sympathy with the pursued Nazis. B, that it is a pretty poor show if 6 Germans can be at large for so long in a hostile country. And C, that an episode such as that in which an Englishman is presented as a dilettante is just playing into German hands, and the toughness of the parry-off doesn't redress the negative effect. Here's another one.
And these are criticisms from the time?
Yeah, from newspapers in London.
They're current.
Yeah, contemporary.
Mm-hmm.
Whether we like it or not, a picture of the Englishman as soft and decadent has grown up all over the past 10 years, especially in the USA, and it is probably good propaganda to take the bull by the horns and put him on the screen. Here, the trick is to give your audience a picture of someone whom they wrongly think is representative and to turn the tables on them by revealing him as unexpectedly tough. Whatever the opinion over there may be, it is a likely bet that Howard's knockout of the Nazi will be a good propaganda stroke in the USA. So
Pretty accurate.
So the newspapers in London at the time knew this was a propaganda film, and were describing it as such.
And I, gosh, isn't that kind of a no-brainer? Wouldn't it have been presented more or less as such?
It would be presented as a propaganda film.
Right.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's kind of a known quantity.
Yeah.
But they're not necessarily buying into it 100%, just like, okay, we're not going to have any criticism whatsoever as a piece of art, right? So, or even the effectiveness of the propaganda, as it turns out.
Yeah.
They're criticizing it. The effectiveness of the propaganda, that's pretty entertaining.
It's almost like, well, then does it cease to be propaganda? Like if you,
I don't know, it's
you're openly allowed to criticize it. Like you couldn't do that in Berlin.
You certainly, that's not the way you envision.
Fucking Riefenstahl. You see that she made last night that Freitag die Hertheit or whatever the hell the name of it was. Like you wouldn't be allowed to do that.
No, but I guess that is one of the huge differentiators.
Pressburger got nominated for an Academy Award in 1942 for the 49th Parallel.
I'm sorry, repeat one more time. I apologize.
Pressburger.
Oh, Pressburger did for the writing?
Yeah.
No, and it is. It's kind of crackerjack. It's consistently, the logic is consistent, the speeches, the clever little flipping here to win on a technicality.
Now, I like the speeches, but I have to say, they're more subtle than, say, like you watched the other night, you watched One of Our Aircraft is Missing. That was almost devoid of speeches except for that one, but the Dutch Patriot makes next to the window in the third act. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I almost cried during that speech. I thought that was so amazing. That instead of one big speech in the 49th Parallel, you've got like lots of smaller...
Right.
You've got the one in the Hutterite colony, but that's not like boldly over the top, in my opinion. It's really like not ham-fisted. Is the wrong terminology.
No, it's very firm. It's not very showy.
Right.
There's no yelling.
Right.
Right. There's not a really significant amount of emotion associated with it.
Yeah. I prefer the one in One of Our Aircraft is Missing. Maybe because it's on the opposite side.
It could be.
But both films. And One of Our Aircraft is Missing is like the opposite of the 49th Parallel.
It's right. I kind of viewed it like what is it? Flags of Our Fathers and Sands of Iwo Jima.
Yeah.
They're not. It's not necessarily that direct of a mirror image, but yeah, it is a companion piece, a sister film, if you will.
Yeah.
But I also found that one significantly less satisfying because, well, we'll go into that later.
Well, yeah. This film was banned in Argentina.
That's unexpected.
By Juan Perón.
But they were big fans of, they had some Nazi sympathies going on down there.
I've seen The Boys from Brazil.
Yes.
Well, we're here now at the end. The Canadians, Laurence Olivier. Who knew?
Yep.
Leon Glynis Johns was in this. Charles Victor. These are people that were running around Hollywood at the time.
They were,
So very good. The end. Dave, thanks for watching the 49th Parallel with me.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks for joining Dave and me while we watched the 49th Parallel. The Super 70 podcast is found wherever you find podcasts. If you love it, drop a 5-star review on iTunes. If you don't, drop me a line at thatdylandavis@gmail.com. You can find me, my books, and my blog at www.thatdylandavis.com. All music on this podcast is written and recorded by Rosalind McPhail. You can find her, like you can find me, on Twitter and SoundCloud. I'm Dylan Davis. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on the long way back home to Sweden.